Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to the Human Action Podcast. My usual co-host, Bob Murphy, is on vacation this week. I'm not going to tell you where because I don't want any of you publicity seekers or autograph hounds to go bother him as he's languishing on the beach at a resort. But anyway, I believe most of you probably know our guest. There's Connor Boyack. Connor runs Libertas Institute out in Utah, which is a state-based think tank, which has had a lot of effective policy implementation in that beautiful state. But more importantly, for our purposes today, he is, of course, the author of the Tuttle Twins series. And the newest, latest, greatest Tuttle Twins is a little different, folks. It's hardcover, it's longer, and it's more substantial. It's called Tuttle Twins Series of Stories, America's History, 1215 to 1776. So, Connor, great to see you, buddy. How you doing?
Thanks, Jeff. I'm doing great. How are you?
Well, okay, so we've talked about this offline. I noticed when I got the book, obviously it is inscribed in the inside, dedicated to Murray Rothbard for looking at history through a lens of liberty. So at least loosely, Rothbard's 5-volume Conceived in Liberty animates this book somewhat?
Yeah, so I think most of your listeners will know that traditionally our children's series with the Tuttle Twins is they're all based off of, classic important books. We've got, Road to Serfdom, Economics in One Lesson, Human Action. Our coup de grace perhaps was somehow turning Anatomy of the State into a children's book that parents wouldn't revolt about. So with this one, where we want to do American history, for both Elijah and I, Conceived in Liberty was the clear choice. It was always just so amazing to us how deep his insights were before the internet, of like having all these, little tidbits of knowledge and perspective. And so, we're not just taking that book and making a children's version. We are kind of picking and choosing the bits that we can use to keep a narrative story kind of moving forward. But at Rothbard's books, we utilize them heavily. Patrick Newman was very gracious in advising us and offering his kind of summaries and perspectives on top of that. It was all super helpful to us as Elijah and I were working on the story.
Well, I want to start with a term that sometimes is treated with disrespect, revisionism. Now, Rothbard was a big believer in revisionism. As a matter of fact, we will link in our show notes a 1976 article he wrote in the Libertarian Forum called The Case for Revisionism. And to Rothbard, a lot of history is bunk because it's written by sort of the statist victors, and that there's an important role, even at the Mises Institute, when Lew Rockwell and Murray Rothbard were talking about starting the organization, the idea that we should apply a revisionist lens to history in order to get at truth was important to Rothbard. And I think, at least in some small part, that's what you do with the Tuttle Twins.
It is, and I'll explain it this way. The 1619 project, which most people know about, I think is a similar kind of revisionist approach to dictate a new future and a new direction based on framing the past differently. And so for us, we've almost toyed with creating a marketing project for the book called the 1215 Project, since our book starts around then to really tell the history of America's founding. But for me, it lands home this way. I was bullied in high school a lot. I was very short. I was a late bloomer. I was stuffed in trash cans, beaten up, like all kinds of stuff. Now, I can frame my own history to say I'm a victim. Other people are out to get me. All these problems in life stem from my upbringing and those experiences. I should have reparations of some kind. Every problem I have today can be traced. So I can frame my past and let it affect my present and my future that way. Or I could say, maybe those kids were being abused at home and they didn't know how to take it out, so they took it out on me. Maybe I can have compassion for the underdog today. Maybe I can have a measure of grace for other people. I can frame my own past in a way that better empowers me to have a productive and uplifting present and future. So that's what we're trying to do with the Tuttle Twins, not just regurgitate all the historical facts dryly, but much like Rothbard was saying, I think is like, we want to look at this with a particular intent, and that is to extract from history a narrative that suits us in having a future of liberty, to understand how those elements happened in the past and how they can inform what we do today.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the 1619 Project. And of course, the idea that we should go back and look at American history or any other history, warts and all, I can certainly agree with that. I don't think most of us have a problem with that. It just seems like it always goes in one direction. A lot of listeners are probably familiar with Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States. So I've read that. I enjoyed that. I thought that was very, very interesting. But that revisionism only seems to go in one way, and it's always sort of a left-wing direction, serving status goals, serving left progressive political goals today. That always seems to be the real reason for the history rewrites. So, the 1619 Project people don't go back and read Rothbard and say, well, here we can look at American history through this liberty versus power analysis. They just go back and say, well, the entire sum of U.S. history is basically the Black experience, mainly slavery and Jim Crow. And of course, that isn't the entire sum of U.S. history. So I imagine, and I know you've had some articles written about you and Jacobin and other places, I imagine you get hit with a right-wing moniker by your critics.
Oh, very much so. And propagandists and all the rest. And I always like to meet them where they're at and say, guilty as charged. I mean, if you really understand what propaganda is in its pure sense, it's the propagation of ideas. And every parent is a propagandist. We are all indoctrinating children. We're teaching them the doctrine. The ultimate question is, whose propaganda? Whose doctrine are we teaching? Do we surrender to the state and let it and its functionaries kind of perpetuate its narrative to push that on unsuspecting children? Or do we empower parents to say, you believe in this particular worldview, we're going to help you talk about that worldview to your children? So yes, this is propaganda. Yes, this is indoctrination, but in its true sense, not in the version where the teacher closes the door and then uses their bully pulpit to, push these ideas on the kids. Quite the opposite. That is to get into the kitchen and the dining room and the living room and say, hey, mom, hey, dad, read this together, talk about it with your kids, take from it what suits you, leave behind the rest. That's fine. But it's more about empowering families rather than pushing an agenda, something I think that we have too little of today, because as we saw during COVID with Zoom school, parents are suddenly freaking out when they realize what their kids were teaching now that they got to see a little bit behind the scenes. And that's not what we're about.
Well, how about the idea that America is a great place and we're actually all quite fortunate to have been born here? Is that radical?
Today, yes. All right. Like to express a measure of optimism and gratitude. Yeah. At the last chapter of our book in particular is bringing this up. It's a Independence Day celebration, and the Tuttle family, they're out with the community and celebrating, but there's a protest, kind of like a critical race theory-esque type of protest where people are, saying, oh, the indigenous tribes and the slaves and, you're all hypocrites claiming that you believe in freedom because look at these oppressed people, and trying to inject a little bit of this narrative. We didn't want to get too on the nose or too, explicit, but we wanted to raise this idea. So Emily, it kind of lands for her. She's like, well, wait a minute, maybe they're right. Maybe, like, who are we to celebrate independence and be happy about what's going on if there are some people who have been mistreated? And so she's kind of struggling with this idea. And it's another couple of recurring characters in our book who come to her and who happen to have kind of the minority ethnic background, who are like, don't listen to that. I'm not a victim. I'm very fortunate. I'm making something of my life. And we could acknowledge the bad in the past in order to not repeat it. But we don't need to, self-flagellate and beat ourselves up. If anything, we should, again, take the good, leave the bad, and kind of have a better direction, where I think ultimately the aims, and this is Connor's opinion, of, the critical race theory folks, the 1619 project folks, I think their aim is not to discredit the founding fathers. It's not to tear down the statues and get everyone to hate, Jefferson and have Monticello and others kind of turning against their, progenitors and so forth. It's, I think, to discard their classical liberal ideas by tearing down the statues and calling the founding fathers white supremacist bigots. I think the attempt behind these kind of Marxist oriented people today is to undermine the credibility and the appealing nature and the heritage of the classical liberal ideas that the American tradition is built upon. Really, I think that's the ultimate aim. And so for us, it's quite the opposite. It's to restore these ideas and say, America is great precisely because it's connected to these ideas. And to the extent we deviate from them, it's not going to be so great. Let's be grateful for that heritage with all the warts and bumps that you pointed out, Jeff, or mentioned. But let's recognize how amazing those are, and then lean into that and say, let's hold on to, let's not make America great. Let's keep what has made America great in the past. Yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it? Because the idea of the right or libertarians as beautiful losers, there's always been this idea, attack the idea, not the person. And of course, we see the left does the opposite extremely effectively. So that should give us maybe pause when it comes to thinking about strategy. But I would like to point out that CRT, the 1619 Project, Howard Zinn, all of these get boosted in the New York Times. They get into mainstream classrooms, mainstream universities. Rothbard and the Tuttle Twins don't. I mean, I think we should acknowledge that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Here's maybe a related point. I'm reading a book right now, which I found fascinating. It's called How to Hide an Empire. I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head. I'm about 2/3 into the book, but the whole book is about what used to be called, I guess, the Greater United States and the colonialism of America when it comes in present tense in a lot of cases to Hawaii and Alaska and Puerto Rico and the Philippines, and learning about how America in the past and certain leaders and Teddy Roosevelt and all these guys were outright imperialists trying to acquire land and resources, totally racist bigots, and seeing these people as subhuman and not American, even though they were U.S. nationals. And it's a fascinating history. I bring this up, Jeff, because this stuff was never taught to me in the classroom. This kind of checkered past of America. It's very much this kind of confined narrative to whatever suits the thought police and the elite today. And we all know this quote: "Those who don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it." And it's like, if we don't understand what's happened in the past, how do we prevent it from happening in the future? And here I am, I think, kind of an avid student of history and writing now books about history and all this stuff. And I'm reading this book about the Philippines and how the bloodiest American wars, it wasn't the Civil War, it was over in the Philippines. I had never encountered this stuff before. And so I think there is a level of suppression of information that is not ideal to the victors and to the current narrative. And that troubles me because there's so many lessons to be learned in those stories that would make us more informed individual citizens today. And I just think the public schools, people say, I speak to a lot of parents groups and they say, Connor, the public school system is broken. What do we do? And I say, hold up. I don't think it's broken. I think it's doing exactly what John Dewey and Horace Mann and all these guys designed it to do. And part of that is the suppression of, dissident level information. They don't want critical thinking. They don't want people reading about the state's, clear failings in the past, the internment of the Japanese and all these different things. And so it's pushed down the Orwellian memory hole. And is it any wonder today we have all these apathetic, fully schooled 18-year-olds that are pumped into the voting system that are completely clueless? I think that's all by design. And what I think we're trying to do in some small measure with the Tuttle Twins is, have a course correction and make sure these young people are being exposed to these ideas before they start voting based upon them.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's this whole genre, Connor, of YouTubes where people go to the beach or a public street somewhere and ask man on the street questions like what U.S. states border Canada, things like that. And obviously the YouTube is designed to titillate or whatever by showing how stupid everybody is and uninformed. But man, oh man, I bet you if you went outside on the street where your office is right now and asked people to tell you about the Magna Carta and the importance of 1215, I'm not sure what you'd get, frankly.
Probably not a lot. And to that I say it's not a public school system, it's a public fool system. We somehow think that schooling and education are the same thing. It's actually kind of interesting. Our audience is split right down the middle. The Tuttle Twins audience, half of them are homeschoolers. So for that, and of course that audience has exploded in the past couple of years. I think it's tripled across the country. So for them, our books and materials, it's more curriculum, right? It's like, hey, we're going to sit down and this will be your civics or your history or your economics. But what's more interesting to me is talking to the other half of the audience who are in, public, private, or charter school. It's mostly public. And so we've done a lot of like little focus groups and surveys and stuff, trying to understand how are those people using these books. And nearly unanimously for them, they like when we give them kind of these options to choose from, they feel like it is a counter agent, right? It's an inoculation against the like infectious ideological diseases of the classroom. And those parents, for whatever reason, have chosen or can't or whatever, they can't homeschool, and that's just not what they're doing. But they know that their kids both are not learning the right stuff, and they're actively being taught the bad stuff. And so it's like, sending your kid into battle without armor or shield, now you can have that. And so for me, it's this question of intentionality of like, you will lose every battle you don't know is being fought. And if parents don't realize that we're in the middle of an ideological war and that, our children's minds are effectively ground zero, then you'll lose every day. And so let's at least, again, you're going to put your kids in school or not, fine. Understand that everyone's got different life paths and choices, but my heavens, at least, give them that armor, at least recognize that it is a battle. And before you just plug them into TikTok and let them go nuts, like let's have some conversations and make sure that they're learning the good stuff.
Well, I think it's an obligation on all of us. And if any particular listeners don't have children, you have friends, you have nieces and nephews, you have young people in your lives. And Connor, I think we're all homeschooling. Even if your kid goes to a traditional school, public or private, they're home and you're reading with them, right? You're teaching them how to separate the whites from the darks so they don't screw up the laundry. You're teaching them how to drive, whatever it might be. We're all homeschoolers, I think, in that sense, if we have kids. What's interesting is that you talk about the Magna Carta in 1215. We think of the Magna Carta countries of the Anglosphere, the countries where there's some sort of charter of rights available to common people against a sovereign. The so-called Magna Carta nations didn't do so well during COVID, Connor, when it comes to due process and all kinds of things. When we think of the United States and Canada and Western Europe and Australia and New Zealand, in many ways, they were as or more draconian than some of the non-Anglosphere countries.
I think it was Madison who said that the Constitution is a mere parchment barrier, or could be if the culture and the values and the ideas are not there to support it, if the citizenry is not educated. And I think that's what we're at. I mean, it's the whole Benjamin Franklin, a republic if you can keep it. All of this is predicated, as many more of the founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, and all the rest, repeatedly said that this experiment is built on the idea of an informed citizenry who understand these ideas. And so you're right. Like we've got these paper documents, the Anglosphere, the Magna Carta, Constitution, whatever. Of course, tons of other countries have modified or I should say modeled their constitutions based on the U.S. Constitution after it was written. But of what good are any of those protections if none of the legislators and none of the judges and no one else really cares, doesn't really understand? Yes. Just, I think this week there were congressional hearings on some gun control stuff, and some of the Republicans put up these big signs behind them, shall not be infringed, trying to remind us about the Second Amendment, what it means. But to the, Congress folks on the left, like they don't care. It's a conventionally useful thing when you want to claim that there's a constitutional right, but it has not really served as an impediment to the rest of us. Ultimately, I think we're in a war of ideas. We can fight lawsuits and hope we get good judges to interpret the Constitution the right way or whatever. But if the people are not in line ideologically, culturally with the ideas that are in the document, then of what purpose is it? It's not going to be a defense. And I really think that's the struggle we're in. Think of this, Jeff. You and I both lead organizations that are trying to educate adults. And there are hundreds of them out there. But the analogy that I use is imagine a garden, and it's an orchard. It's full of these diseased, decaying trees, gnarled and knotted. And you and I and others are out there trying to fertilize these trees back to good health with our ideas. We're reaching these adults, trying to nurture them back to the right, path and be fruitful. And that's important. We have to do that. But good grief, you're a horrible gardener if you are not also focused on protecting the seeds and the saplings to make sure that they avoid that same rot. And I feel like those of us in the liberty movement, broadly speaking, however you want to define that, we've been playing defense because we're always waiting until people are adults. We're surrendering them to the school system for their most formative years of intellectual development. And then we turn around and say, okay, what have we got? Oh, a bunch of ignoramuses who are social justice warriors. All right, let's try and improve that. Like if we took 1/10 of the investment that this whole movement is putting into adults, which we need to continue to do, like we got to do that. But if we took 1/10 of that and invested it in focusing on the rising generation and supporting parents and talking to their kids about these ideas, total game changer. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's a rallying cry beyond just producing the Tuttle Twins materials and selling them to the people who want them. It's very much within my kind of nonprofit think tank community trying to say, hey guys, like we need way more of this stuff. Because I'd like to win. I'd like to go on the offense and not always lose. I think you said like the graceful defeat of the libertarians that we're used to. I'm tired of that. I want to go on the offense. And to me, it means going after the young.
Well, it's remarkable how we send our kids off to spend 8 hours a day, basically amongst a bunch of left-wing women. I mean, almost all elementary school teachers are female. There's hardly any male role models. I mean, and then, all of a sudden they come home 18 and surly, going through their Kurt Cobain phase or whatever. I'm dating myself, And look, Connor, I hope it's a war of ideas that we're engaged in. I hope that's all it is. And that's what we're trying to do here. When you start talking about the Western canon and of course, England, as our parent nation in many ways plays a big role here. But even before the Magna Carta, you go back and talk a little bit, you and Elijah talk a little bit about the Silk Road and trade. And that really stuck out to me, first of all, of course, because of the Silk Road and poor Ross Ulbricht is still in jail, which is a tragedy. But then I have a good friend of the Institute named John Lang, and he studies evolutionary biology. He likes Matt Ridley and that sort of thing. And he goes, when you go back and you look at books about evolutionary biology, if you go to the index, there won't be anything about trade. We tend to think that history was solely a matter of conquest, and that's the mechanism by which, in sometimes actual DNA, but more importantly, ideas and goods travel. But there was actually an element of trade that almost goes through the bloodstream of civilization, like DNA, which wasn't necessarily force. And you could do a whole book on the Silk Road, I think.
You definitely could. And Elijah and I both wanted to start back then because for us, context is everything when you're teaching history. It's why I hated history in school. It was the memorization of names and dates and which battle happened when and who said what thing to who at which convention and like all that stuff. I couldn't stand that. But it's the context that allows us to tell a story. Mm-hmm. And so for us, when Elijah and I were working on this, reading Rothbard, trying to kind of figure out this narrative that we were going to do, for us, it was like, okay, why does America exist? Okay, America exists now because of colonization. Well, why did that colonization occur? Well, that was because of exploration. You had all these people going across ships, risking blood and treasure to search for something. What were they searching for? Well, they're going for spices and riches and resources why? Why were they? Well, it's because the Silk Road was exploding and you had this kind of, massive network of trade happening where people were financially incentivized to bring in new things because everything was, commoditizing. There was the common stuff. And then, have you seen this, amazing new thing from this faraway land? And so ultimately the story of America, we felt like was this kind of inception of trade that sparked exploration, which sparked colonization, an unfortunate aspect of things in some respects, which led to America. So you go to the 1619 folks and they say, well, the story of America is a story of importation of slavery, without which the economy would not have prospered like it did. And you built America on the backs of these, oppressed Black people. Well, sure, that's a thread to the story. We should acknowledge it. We should talk about it. We should understand it. But it itself needs context because that's not the full story. And for Elijah and I, we felt like going back to the 1200s with Marco Polo and the Silk Road was a more authentic story. Getting back to our earlier part of the conversation, Jeff, it's also a way to frame the past in a way that helps us better understand the future in a very kind of productive way, to understand how central it is, how central trade is to kind of political and economic development. And we thought it worked. We thought it, and now that the book's been out for a few weeks, a bunch of the comments that we've gotten have all been, my gosh, I didn't realize back in the 1200s that was happening and how it's connected to our world today. And so I think the readers are really appreciating, unlike Ron Swanson, who believed, history started in 1776 and everything before that didn't matter. I think a lot of our readers have appreciated the context of what was going on that led to America today, because it is the context that tells the story. And so for us, it was a good move to start that way.
So let me ask you a tough one. The idea of America as a creedal nation, or an idea, a portable nation that you could, in theory, recreate anywhere, versus America as a particular nation with, particular people, history, geography, resources that made it what it is. That's a tough question, but it's still raging.
I like this question. I'll confess that I lean towards the latter. I think the American experiment was so unique in large measure because you had this blank canvas upon which to experiment. You had the colonies, in many respects, being completely ignored by Parliament. You look at like Lieberland and these kind of economic development zones today. They're trying to carve out these little pieces of state-controlled, lands. They're not working. They're not flourishing. It's hard to beg permission for freedom rather than just go out and actualize it by moving to the frontier, planting a flag and saying, these 20 acres are now my homestead. So I've wondered about that. The ideas clearly permeate across, socioeconomic background, and the ideas of liberty can and should be applied to any form of government and any people at any time. I believe these things. But I've wondered in my advocacy role with my think tank, was that a kind of a one-off where we can't really rise back to that level? I mean, even the founding fathers and just their upbringing and the circumstances, that the fact that they didn't have TikTok to get addicted to, they, read about the Greco-Roman Empire and we're learning Latin and all these things that just don't happen today. So I lean towards the latter, Jeff. I'd be curious your thoughts on this, but I feel like in a lot of respects, it was kind of this one-off that we couldn't fully or even close replicate today. Like we should try. It's kind of like Jesus saying, be therefore perfect. We're not going to be perfect. We should still aspire for that. But anyways, I'd love to know your thoughts.
Well, I think there are human universals when it comes to our innate desire for happiness and our need for sustenance and aggression and murder, things like that, as universally harmful. But even the definition of murder, for example, is not universal. We differ over abortion. Is just one example. But I'm not a universalist politically. I don't want to go back to the 1960s and try to impose the U.S. Constitution on Lee Kuan Yew, who literally brought Singapore from a swampy wasteland into an absolute economic powerhouse. And he did some pretty unpleasant things to do that. Okay. So I guess I'm against political universalism or globalism. And I'm suspicious. I'm suspicious of the idea of America as this portable nation that would work anywhere. I think if a lot of very happy things happened to make America the material powerhouse it is. One is that it was surrounded by two vast oceans, which back in the day made it very tough to attack militarily. Yeah. It had lots and lots of arable farmland and continues to today. We can feed ourselves and still export. It had lots and lots and lots of timber and continues to today, although not of the same quality, which meant we could build log cabins and burn fires and that sort of thing. It had just lots of land and elbow room in and of itself was a huge benefit and blessing. So I'm friends with Pedro Gonzalez at Chronicles Magazine, and he really comes down heavily on this particularism argument. But, I think it informs the way you and Elijah organize the book, because you don't go through it's not organized the way people might expect in a boring chronological way. It's more like there's vignettes surrounding certain particular events that have become infamous. And I like the way that you guys didn't give this bowdlerized view of, the Americans were just these great, noble frontiersmen in the colonies, and that big, bad King George was just totally bad. And he was, it's not that way. It's not black and white, and you don't present it that way.
And that's certainly intentional. So this is volume 1. We're likely going to do 4 volumes. I was sharing on Tom Wood's podcast something I think your listeners would likely also enjoy. The loose structure that we're thinking of is, here volume 1 goes through 1776, so it's birth of the Revolution. And then volume 2 would be through 1789, so that would be birth of the Republic. And then volume 3 will probably go through the war between the states, post-Reconstruction, birth of the nation state. Volume 4, we're thinking of going all the way through the World Wars and ending with Dwight D. Eisenhower and his farewell speech warning of the military-industrial complex. So that's birth of the empire. So these kind of 4 kind of periods of American history. But to your point, we're not trying to cram a particular perspective down people's throats. What we're really trying to do is foster some conversations, because you're right, with these little vignettes, we're not going deep and having this 30-page, expose on this individual or that event. We're trying to plant a lot of curiosity seeds so that as mom and her kids are reading, or a dad with his son or whatever, they're like, hey, I didn't know about this guy. Let's go watch a YouTube video about him, or let's find a biography, or we're really just trying to foster curiosity and more exploration. And so for us, it's like, you got to have a narrative that's fun and enjoyable for kids to read. You got to have something that's meaty enough so that they feel like it's not just a fluffy story, but you can't give everything away, because then people see that this is the authoritative history book. We're really trying to just introduce them to a lot of people and ideas and events, give them enough substance so that they feel that they're learning, but not enough that they feel like they don't need to continue that intellectual journey. And so, for example, at Tom's wedding a few weeks ago, I was asking Tom DiLorenzo, we were chatting for a little while about when we're going to talk about, Lincoln and the war. And certainly, Tom's got his very strong views that I very strongly sympathize with. I've read most of his books. But for us, I don't want to come down in the book and say, Lincoln was horrible and he did all these horrible things and he was totally wrong, and the South were these victims and the North was wrong and all the things. Just like in volume 1, we didn't want to do that with, the crown and the colonies. So what we're really trying to do, and likely going to do in volume 2 and others, is just tease up these conflicts and say, well, the history books today say that North was great and South was evil. Case closed. Abraham Lincoln was our Lord and Savior. We're going to try and open it up and say, there's actually some fair arguments on the other side. Here's what the debate was actually about, or what some of the different arguments were. What do you think? Volume 1, we really went to strides to say, and Ethan and Emily were both asking at one point, are those the good guys or were those the bad guys? And they're corrected in the book to say, actually, there's really no such thing. We focus on the good ideas, the bad ideas, but it's not so reductive to say that, England bad, America good, nor with the North and the South in the Civil War and other things. So we're trying to get rid of that absolutism and the victor writes the history that will be consumed by everyone, and trying to show that complex humans have nuance, and sometimes there's fair arguments on the other side that you might not have considered. Let's explore those, always through a lens of liberty, ultimately, is what we're trying to do. But again, really, it's just let's have some conversations about stuff that teachers and textbooks don't really want us learning about, and see where it goes.
What's fascinating is that ever since, not that long after the Revolutionary period, England has been one of the top, if not our top, trading partner and political ally all that time, even after a war. So I guess in a sense that's hopeful, that we don't have to view wars as things that have to divide us forever. And I wish more history was written about ordinary people's lives and the commercial and trade of a time and place, the commerce and trade of a time and place, as opposed to just the wars and the political figures, which is what we tend to get in high school. I'm curious, what would be the target age group for this particular? Now, this is a hardcover. This is longer than your typical Tuttle Twins book. What would you say is the age group you're looking at?
So this book, it's about 240 pages. There's 11 chapters. So we did a bunch of test reads with families to try and figure that out. Because our children's books, we say 5 to 11 years of age, roughly. This one we're positioning as 7 to 13. Okay. It's longer. It's a little bit meatier. So we felt like the 5 and 6-year-olds were struggling a bit, but we were still connecting into the preteens pretty well. So 7 to 13 is where we've landed. Although I will say the magic of what we do with Tuttle Twins is that it exceeds those age ranges all the time. You got the little kids who will sit and look at the pictures that Elijah draws and love the little pets or Easter eggs or things that he does. And then you got these teenagers who, like, a format like this is clearly beneath them in terms of the format itself, but they've often never encountered these ideas before. And honestly, Jeff, like, the thing that shocked both Elijah and I when we started, I didn't plan for this at all. Like, we thought we were doing kids books, like, let's teach kids these ideas. And that's what we set out to do. But what we have since realized is that over half of the families who get our books, the parents themselves are learning, and they're answering this way in the surveys. They are learning these ideas for the first time. Like, how many moms, when you stop in the grocery store, you hand them Human Action or, Road to Serfdom, or even The Law by Bostad, which isn't very long. How many of them would actually, sit down and read that? Very, very few. But when you talk to those parents, like, I'm a religious watcher of Shark Tank. And Cuban all the time is talking about how people will be very stingy when it comes to spending money on themselves, but they will pay inordinate amounts of money for their pets and their kids. Like, they're not nearly as discriminating with so those businesses tend to succeed. So when we go to these moms in the grocery store, our fictional mom, and we say, hey, do you want your kid to be well-rounded or a critical thinker or entrepreneurial or, whatever? Oh yeah. Okay. Hey, these books help. So they sit down and read them. And now mom is getting exposed to these ideas for the first time that they know. And then at the end of our books, as we do in this book, it's like, hey, go read the original, go get, Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty, get a little bit more. And so it's been such an amazing way to introduce a lot of, new people to these authors, thinkers, writers, their ideas. Honestly, it makes me optimistic. I generally lean a little bit pessimistic, but this project has given me a lot of hope for the future because we see how all these new people are learning about these ideas because we've taken the barriers down. It's not a 300-page book written a century ago. It's not in, English with multiple syllable words that people can't stomach anymore. Hey, read this picture book and learn about liberty. And it's just been very effective and super enjoyable to be a part of.
Well, and let's be honest, and this is no knock on those parents. Look, people are out there trying to pay their mortgage, whatever they're doing all day. People went to crappy schools. I mean, I guarantee you there are plenty of people who get this book for their kids or grandkids who never heard of the Magna Carta, and this is their first introduction to it. So if this is your first introduction to it and you're 65, better late than never, right? I mean, that's a great thing. But I want to get back to this idea of going up to housewives at grocery store and giving them Human Action, because I haven't done that, and I'm married. I don't think that would work, even were I not married. I'm pretty sure that wouldn't work. Tuttle Twins might work, but I want to bring up one thing about later in the book when you're just talking about the tumult leading up to the Revolutionary period. We have this hubris, I think, in modern life that the digital communications devices we all have in our pockets adds to, which is that we live in such unprecedented times of rapid change and tumult. And that's just, excuse my French, that's just total bullshit. I have childhood memories of my great-grandmother. She only lived until I was about 5 or 6. But she was born in the late 1800s. So in her lifetime, she went from outdoor plumbing, no electricity, to, homes with electricity, electric lights, radio, automobiles, air travel, television, space travel, just before she died. And I think one of the most important things about history is puncturing our self-importance, I guess.
I like that. I might borrow that line. I'll credit you if I do. I was talking to a buddy of mine who's a historian. His name's Greg Wright. He runs a podcast that I recommend called History That Doesn't Suck. And it's all storytelling. It's just, he tells a story and you go along for the adventure. So we were talking about this. He lives here locally. We're at breakfast the other day. And he told me he was working on a book about this, actually, because he hears this argument that the tumult, the toxicity, people are like, there's so much contention and we're so divided. And so for him, he's like, this is like completely ludicrous. Mm-hmm. Anyone who says that it's worse today than it ever has been clearly has not opened a history book. I mean, when was the last time we had a duel, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we don't have any, people beating it, or you see like in other countries where their parliament, they're ending in brawls where it's just like you see these videos on YouTube and everyone's just like landing blows on people. So I don't know, it's easy to beat ourselves up. It's easy to be very myopic and kind of just dismissively and ignorantly think it's never been this bad. Or I think it was Louis C.K. in one of his interviews on like Jay Leno or whatever, to your point about the technological progress, he has this great bit. He's sitting there and he's like, I'm on an airplane and I'm looking around, everyone's miserable and they're just upset, shuffling onto the plane and getting cranky with their elbow room. And I'm looking around and I'm like, you people are insane. Do you not realize that we're like in a flying metal tube? Like how amazing that is. And so to me, it's you point out, like even with your, was it your grandma?
Great
said it was? Great grandmother. To go in one lifespan to see so little and then see so much. When we understand our history, I think to your earlier point about gratitude, it helps us better appreciate what we have today to understand what it was like back then. I think similarly, and maybe in the opposite, it can also make us more motivated and active in our desire for a better world today to understand the ideas and the intellect and the ideology and the philosophy and everything of our founding generation, for example, to like look at what these guys were studying and what they were doing and the discourse they were having and whatever. Like if we want to save our country today, we have to restore some aspect of that. We have to do some of this stuff. So to me, like I hated history in school. It wasn't, in fact, I told Tom this on his podcast, the book that changed for me was Nullification. Someone, I think, gave me a copy or I found it online, and that opened my eyes to learning history in a far more. So then I started reading all these history books, and Ron Paul had his like recommended reading list. So I'm just like going down all these books, and I went on a binge because I suddenly learned for the first time that when you consume history as a story and then try and learn from it what, not just like, hey, that's interesting, those things happen, but more like with Nullification, it was, I read the book and then I started talking to lawmakers here in my state, like, hey guys, let's do something. And so when history is presented in a way that empowers us to act, I think it is so much more enjoyable. And I have over here, they're out of frame, but I have a stack of social studies books. When we first started this project 2 years ago, we're flipping through all these books, and none of them teach kids things that they can apply in their lives today. It's all stuff that happened long ago. You need to memorize it. But there's nothing in there to say, here's how you can take this information and fight for a better world or empower yourself. So what we're trying to do with our book is not just teach what happened, but provoke them with questions to say, what does that mean for you today? How does that apply to our world today? Because that's, I think, how we learn from the past so that we don't repeat its mistakes.
So what is the best way for people to get hold of this book and the other Tuttle Twins if they're so inclined?
So Mises Institute is now stocked with copies. You can get it there. You can also go to TuttleTwins.com/history and pick up a copy there and start reading. Well,
Connor, I want to thank you for filling in for Bob Murphy, who is, as I mentioned, languishing on vacation, as is his
Not
wont.
nearly as handsome as he, but
yes. So
I'll have to do.
Hey, I want to congratulate you on this, and I want to encourage you very much to consider doing those other Tuttle Twins history books up and through the Eisenhower era, as you mentioned, because I think that's something that the world needs.
Thank you. Yeah, we're excited. We're already starting to work on volume 2, Elijah and I. Still kind of using Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty because it covers the same kind of constitutional period. So maybe he'll get the forward in this book as well. I don't know. But volume 2, we're working on. Hope to have it out, much like volume 1, by the 4th of July next year. So it's in the works, and we'll get working on it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you need to avail yourselves of these books. Get them in the hands of your kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews, whoever you want. And I might add, they're also beautifully illustrated. So they're a pleasure to spend time with. Connor, thanks a million. Ladies and gentlemen, you have a great weekend.